This is China. You probably know that today it's one of the most powerful countries in the world. But just over 100 years ago, the story was very different. So how did this country go from ravaged by imperial powers to the modern economic superpower that we know today? My name is Anish, and in this video, I'm going to cover China's entire 20th century, from the fall of the Qing dynasty to the Chinese economic miracle. I'm probably going to mispronounce every name here, but I'll try my best. And without further ado, this is a story of China's entire 20th century. Okay, to give some context, the 19th century was not exactly a fun time for China. The period saw instability and some of the largest rebellions in history. Then foreigners started to come in and really exploit the country. Everyone messed with China. First came the British with the Opium Wars setting up the treaty port system, and then other countries such as France, Germany, Russia and Japan all wanted a piece of action, and this period is known as China's century of humiliation. These countries started to govern and occupy little enclaves within major cities, and these foreign devils were blamed for China's failures. China had a war with Japan in 1894 over influence in Korea, and it revealed the backwardness of the Chinese military. Japan only 50 years before was in a very similar position to China, but they had skyrocketed past them and proved that modernization along Western models was crucial in protecting China's sovereignty. But who were the people in charge of the most populated country in the world? Well, it was the Qing dynasty that had ruled China from the Forbidden City in Beijing since the 17th century. This family were ethnically Manchu, whilst the vast majority of the Chinese population were Han Chinese. To many Chinese, the Qing themselves were foreigners that discriminated against and were destroying traditional Han Chinese culture. The Guangzhou Emperor officially ruled China, although it was his aunt, the Dowager Empress Cixi, who really pulled the strings. The Empress was quite conservative in her thinking and wanted to keep the old system in place, based on Confucianism as a state ideology. However, even she recognised the need for some sort of reform at the end of the 19th century, and the government started to adopt Western policies and obtained help from foreigners to try and modernise China. With the help of foreigners came more traders, railways, and even some Christian missionaries who were fairly insensitive towards Chinese customs. Many people saw these changes as a threat to the traditional Chinese way of life, and they were very unpopular with the people. All this discontent about the state of China resulted in a massive rebellion in 1900 called the Boxer Uprising. This was an uprising that originated in the north of China, and it attempted to drive out all foreigners from the country. The Boxers were mainly peasants, and they had some pretty interesting beliefs, such as being immune to bullets and the swords of their enemies. Anyways, they attacked Christian missionaries and destroyed Western property, and then put the legation quarter in Beijing under siege for 55 days. But they were pro-dynasty, with their slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreign." The Dowager Empress actually backed the Boxers and ordered all foreign diplomats to leave Beijing. This was going to prove a huge mistake though, because in the days of full guns blazing imperialism, you already know that the West and Japan are not going to let a bunch of peasants destroy their very powerful influence in China. An 8-nation alliance sent in over 50,000 soldiers and 51 ships, absolutely crushing the rebellion and looting the capital. And it felt like the whole world was against China. In the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, around 100,000 people were killed, and the Qing were now forced to pay huge indemnity payments, further impoverishing the state. The emperors now reluctantly agreed to undergo a proper reform of education, the military, and the economy. As Andrew Marr writes, it was dragging a vast empire of peasants and landlords into the age of the industrial urban mankind. While conservatives thought that the reforms were too radical, whilst others thought they were too slow. Basically, there's no pleasing everyone, and a lot of anti-Qing groups and activists started to emerge. One of these groups was a secret society called the Tongmenghui of China, founded by Western-educated Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And remember this guy, he's gonna be important. His underground resistance movement wanted to see the Manchus expelled and a revival of Han nationalism under a new united government. Sun was involved in almost every Chinese uprising in the next decade, all of which failed, but he would still become the face of the Chinese revolutionary movement. So the empress died in 1908, and the Guangzhou emperor conveniently died the day before. This cute little kid Puyi comes to power, and he's aged only 2, so he wasn't exactly the strong ruler that China needed. Anyways, all the anti-Qing sentiment was bubbling under the surface until in October 1911, it all kicked off in Wuhan. You probably heard that before. So some revolutionaries in the new army, some of the most elite soldiers in China, decided to plan an uprising against the government. But before they were even ready to launch the uprising, they accidentally set off one of their own bombs, and then the whole revolution kicked off. In the next day, the entire city was under their control, and their heroics inspired revolutionaries in other provinces to start their own uprisings. Soon the Xinhai Revolution had spread to 14 provinces in China, demanding an end to Qing rule. The government turned to the military man Yuan Shikai to restore order, and instead, Yuan decides to join the revolution and with Sun Yat-sen formed a new government in Nanjing. The revolution was too strong, and in February 1912, Puyi abdicated, ending nearly 2,000 years of imperial rule, and then the creation of the Republic of China. So China becomes a republic, and Yuan Shikai becomes a bit stroppy, and he basically tells the revolutionaries, either make me the leader of China, or make me your biggest enemy, and possibly even risk a civil war. So Sun Yat-sen resigned, and Yuan Shikai became the president of China. China then has its first free elections in 1913, and of course the winner is assassinated, destroying any real chance of democracy. I think the power slightly got to Yuan's head, as he pretty much became a dictator, and he even tried to make himself the new emperor, the position they had just abolished. But when he died in 1916, the central government completely collapsed, and China then descended into a period of warlordism and chaos. So the warlord era is marked by the disintegration of China into dozens of different warring states, ruled by former military generals, who wanted what all warlords want: wealth and power. It was not the best time to be alive, and this period saw famines, complete economic stagnation, and of course, a lot of violence. All these different warlords had their own personal armies, and Western guns came in to make sure that just about everyone was shooting each other. But the network of alliances and factions amongst the warlords made sure that no one warlord came out strong enough to rule the whole of China, and the government was controlled by whichever warlord just held Beijing. Speaking of which, this government got into a bit of trouble in 1919. Basically, the Treaty of Versailles that set the terms of peace after the First World War gave Japan some German possessions in Shandong. The Chinese were not happy that Japan was getting their territory, even though China sent in over 100,000 labourers to help the Allies during the war. And did you know of the 33 countries that sent representatives to Versailles, China was the only one not to sign it? Anyway, that didn't change anything, and young intellectuals were not happy that the Chinese government once again was getting pushed around by the West. This led to major demonstrations in Tiananmen Square and nationwide protests called the May 4th movement, with their motto, "May the 4th be with you." Probably. Anyways, Chinese nationalism exploded, and in the wake of this, Sun Yat-sen re-established the Chinese Nationalist Party, aka the Kuomintang. 2 years later, some people met up in Shanghai and said, "That's good and all, but you know what's better? Communism." And thus the Chinese Communist Party was born. The nationalists and the communists will then go on to have a very long and very complicated history of each other. A few years down the line, and Sun Yat-sen woke up one day and decided that he wanted to unify China. So he went to Guangdong in southern China, and the Kuomintang started to create an army that could take on the warlords. Sun brought out his main military man to help, a guy called Chiang Kai-shek, and they created the new revolutionary army, with the task of reunifying China. The Soviet Union also tried to help them out, and gave them a whole lot of guns and ammunition, provided that the Kuomintang form an alliance with the Chinese Communist Party. This became known as the First United Front between the Communists and the Nationalists. But in 1925, Sun Yat-sen died, just before he could see his dream of a unified China become a reality. The new revolutionary army got underway and launched their northern expedition. Within a year, they captured Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai, but then some cracks started to emerge within the Kuomintang, with Chiang and the writers within the party setting up a new government in Nanjing, and the leftists and the communists under Wang Jingwei creating a new civilian government in Wuhan. Then Chiang decided to go all psycho and purge the communists. With the help of the Green Gang, who were kind of like Shanghai's mafia, Chiang killed tens of thousands of leftists and communists, and many associate the Shanghai massacre as a true beginning of the Chinese Civil War. Eventually, in 1928, Chiang took Beijing and unified China under his nationalist government. Under his rule, some say he was a fascist, others say he was a military dictator. Either way, there's no denying that he was always impeccably dressed. His vision of a new China wanted to see a modernization of industry and the military, but also keep elements of traditional Chinese culture. To help him modernize China, in a really strange collaboration, he turned to Germany, who would soon be ruled by Nazis. But Chiang was anti-communist and Hitler was anti-communist. It was a match made in heaven. But whilst the communists were still lingering around, in 1931, a new threat to the nationalists emerged: the Empire of Japan. So in northeastern China, there's an area called Manchuria, a region that was sparsely populated, had rich agricultural land, and a lot of natural resources. Basically, if you're going to expand anywhere, this is the perfect place to do it. Russia and Japan literally had a war over it in the early 1900s, and Japan came out the winner, and they got special trading privileges in the region. Japan was hit really hard by the Great Depression, and it highlights the economic importance of Manchuria for Japanese trade and raw materials. So the Japanese army decided to blow up a railway and blame it on the Chinese. Japan used the Mukden incident as an excuse to annex Manchuria and give it a new Japanese name, Manchukuo. To legitimize the puppet state, the Japanese got help from a familiar face. Remember the last emperor Puyi? Yep, that's him. He switched sides and became the new emperor of Manchukuo. But how did the Chinese government respond to this? Obviously, they weren't happy, but Chiang always saw the communists as the biggest threat to China. He pursued a strategy of first internal pacification, then external resistance. Basically, wipe out the communists first, then focus on the threat from Japan. There wasn't a strong resistance to Japanese aggression, and the government lost virtually all of northern China. Both sides agreed to a truce, however, but Japan would still deploy a crap ton of soldiers in China. So the Generalissimo decides to go for round 2 and embark on another extermination campaign against the communists. This involves some encirclement campaigns against the Red Army in their base area, the Jiangxi Soviet. The communists held in there for a while, but in 1934 they were forced on the run. More specifically, a march. A very long march that lasted over 5,000 miles in some of the most inhospitable terrain in China. The CCP marched over 20 miles a day as a military unit for over a year, whilst facing constant attacks from the Kuomintang. Of the 90,000 people that set off from Jiangxi, only around 10,000 people made it to their new base in Yan'an in the northwest of China. But the fact that they made it to Yan'an was a miracle in itself, and you have to respect it. And as far as propaganda goes, this was like the Holy Grail. It was almost like God was on their side, although they were communists, so technically not God. Maybe Karl Marx. Anyway, it was a huge propaganda boost, and the Long March has an almost mythical status in Chinese history. But another massive consequence that came out of the Long March was the rise of Mao Zedong as the undisputed MVP of the Chinese Communist Party. From their new base in Yan'an, safe from the nationalists, the communists could now regroup and grow in strength. For the next few years, the CCP would live in caves, they implemented some land reforms, and a bit of a cult of personality develops around Mao. In the capital, Nanjing, Chiang Kai-shek's constant obsession with the communists alienated a lot of people in his own government, who believed that he was neglecting the real threat from Japan. This led to some generals kidnapping Chiang and putting him under house arrest in Xi'an. With his life and freedom at risk, the Generalissimo reluctantly agreed to end the civil war and cooperate with the communists in the joint defense against the Japanese. This would become known as the Second United Front between the communists and the nationalists. So Japan had been eyeing up a full invasion of China for a while now, and built up their dreamed Asian empire. And it all kicked off in July 1937 on the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, when Chinese and Japanese troops had a little disagreement with each other, and then the guns came out. This marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, also known as the War of Resistance in China. The Imperial Japanese Army then took Beijing and sent troops to Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai was very bloody, but Chinese resistance was able to hang on there for over 3 months and brought time for the government and major industries to relocate. Once the Japanese took Shanghai, they also captured the capital Nanjing and committed some of the worst atrocities in the process. The Japanese wanted to beat the Chinese into submission, but surrender or negotiating with the enemy was never an option. Except for this guy. Remember Wang Jingwei? Well, he decided to switch sides and became the leader of a new puppet government in Nanjing. The Japanese then made rapid advances, and after Wuhan fell in 1938, the Chinese government moved to Chongqing in the far west of China, where they'd remained for the next 7 years. Defense was often left to the locals, and it felt like the government, just like the Qing, weren't able to protect the people from foreign aggression. Who actually came out well from all of this was the communists, who were able to organise some counteroffensives and won support from millions of peasants. At the same time, there's a feeling that Chiang was saving his best troops to finish off the communists once and for all, rather than using them against Japan. Neither the communists or the nationalists were truly allied to each other, but the appearance of cooperation had helped to reduce Chinese bloodshed. Anyways, a few years into the war, and Japan was beginning to overextend itself in China. They wanted to look to expand elsewhere, especially take the natural resources in Southeast Asia. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the USA entered the war, and they realized that the enemy of their enemy is their friend, so China and the US formed a wartime alliance. Finally, in this war, China was not alone. Some felt, though, that in comparison to Britain or the Soviet Union, China was just being treated as a second-class ally. Chiang Kai-shek's wife went on tour in the USA and lobbied massive support for the Chinese war effort. These leaders would eventually meet up in Cairo in 1943, and it was decided that after the war, Japan would be stripped of all its imperial territories, and it established China's status as one of the four great powers of the world. In 1945, President Truman ended the war by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As many as 20 million Chinese may have died during the War of Resistance, which is just an obscene figure. If there is any picture that has so much history behind it, it may be this one, of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao toasting the end of the War of Resistance. But within only a year, the final act of the Chinese Civil War will begin. Under strong international pressure, the nationalists and the communists agreed to talk it out with each other, but both sides didn't trust each other, and both sides wanted full political and military control of China. It just wasn't going to work out, and fighting continued again in 1916. But this time there's a whole Cold War going on, so America and the Soviet Union also get involved. The Kuomintang still had a numerical advantage with about 1.6 million soldiers compared to about 1.2 million for the communists, and their army started to launch large-scale assaults on communist territories. In 1947, the nationalists had taken the CCP capital Yan'an, but never count out the underdog. Communist propaganda of an equal and utopian society won over millions of peasants, and the Kuomintang's bad leadership and corruption kind of destroyed them from the inside. 1948 was a decisive year in the Chinese Civil War, and the communists finally captured Beijing and declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and the most populous country in the world became communist. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, and this has created a bit of a logistical nightmare, because as to this day, Taiwan say that they're the real China, and China say that they're the real China, so maybe the Civil War isn't truly over. Anyway, less than a year later, in 1950, the Korean War started after Kim Jong-un's granddaddy launched an invasion of South Korea. Of course, the Soviets and Chinese were meddling behind the scenes and backed their communist neighbour, so the USA also gets involved and pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the border with China. And just before North Korea could be defeated, China was like, "You're getting way too close, buddy," and sent in the People's Liberation Army to drive out the Americans once and for all. The PLA forces reached the 38th parallel and achieved a stalemate in Korea. Pretty much all foreigners got kicked out of China in the Resist America and Aid Korea campaign, and in the 1950s, America made it pretty clear that they would defend Taiwan from Chinese aggression, even using the threat of nuclear war. The Soviet Union basically turned to China and said, "You're a communist country that hates America. We're a communist country that hates America. Do we just become best friends?" So they signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance in 1950. Anyways, after a decade of all-out war, the country was seriously weak. China needed reform, and propaganda depicted Mao Zedong as just the guy to do that. This same man would be responsible for more deaths than Hitler or Stalin. Okay, so here's a crazy stat. In 1949, 1 in every 6 people in the world was a Chinese peasant. Mao needed to win over the vast majority of the Chinese population, and he had just a plan to do that. He gave the people what they wanted: massive land reforms. As only a small proportion of the elite wealthier peasants called landlords actually owned the land in China, it was the perfect opportunity to attack economic inequality in society. The government essentially confiscated all of their land, and this land was redistributed so that all peasants had a stake in land ownership, in what was called a collective farm. By 1956, over 90% of peasant households were collectivized, and socialism had taken hold in the Chinese countryside. With these early reforms, Mao felt like the Communist Party had done enough to win over the educated. So in 1956, he announced the 100 Flowers campaign, calling for greater openness and allowed intellectuals to freely criticize the party. It was all fun and games until Mao realized that he could be criticized, and he basically turned around and told everyone that this was just a prank to expose some counter-revolutionaries. He then cracked down on intellectuals, and 400,000 people were branded as rightists and sent to forced labor camps, and reiterated that complete authoritarianism would be the Chinese model. Anyway, back to economic reforms. So China tried to model its economy under Soviet-style 5-year plans. The second plan, called the Great Leap Forward, was introduced in 1958, and it basically said that China was going to catch up with the West within a matter of years. It demanded the mobilization of everyone in society, and the entire economy was reorientated around the campaign to take, well, a great leap forward. In the countryside, peasants were told to produce crazy outputs to feed their city workers, and some pretty interesting policies were introduced. People set up their own DIY backyard furnaces to produce their own homemade steel, and surprise, surprise, the steel was of such garbage quality that they couldn't even use it. Local administrators definitely lied to the government about the numbers they were hitting, and all that did was prompt the government to produce even crazier quotas for peasants. Ridiculous quotas, lying to the government, and then some natural disasters created one of the worst famines in human history. The Great Famine killed around 30 million people in rural China. And to give some perspective about how big that number is, around 21 million people died in the entire First World War. Anyway, Mao really screwed up and he had a lot of blood on his hands, but he was still relatively liked by the people. Who wasn't too fond of Mao was like every country in the world. By the 1960s, China had made a lot of enemies. It had fought the USA in the Korean War. When China annexed Tibet, it also brought them into beef with India, but most importantly, China was going through a bad breakup with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had been a long-time supporter of the CCP, and the two largest communist countries in the world formed an alliance in 1950. But when a certain controversial man, Joseph Stalin, had died in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev launched an entire smear campaign on Stalin, calling him out for all the atrocities that he committed. Mao respected Stalin for what he had done for socialism in the USSR, and saw this as an attack on Marxist ideology, and calls Khrushchev a revisionist traitor. Khrushchev then calls Mao an ideological deviationist. Yeah, there was some real communist trash talk, and things definitely got ugly. The Soviets pulled out aid from China in 1960, and China then starts its own independent communist bloc to rival the Soviet Union for influence in the Third World. Mao started to worry that when he died, could the same thing happen to him? Could his image be destroyed by his successors, just like Stalin's was? This inspired Mao to launch the Cultural Revolution, as he unleashed the people to attack his own political party. The revolution kicked off in 1966 after Mao had a dip in the Yangtze River, and symbolized that even at the age of 73, he was still fit to lead his nation. The basis of the revolution was to completely reshape culture and tear down the capitalist and traditional elements of Chinese society. A group called the Gang of Four rose to gain considerable influence, and they wanted to destroy the four olds in China. These were old customs, old habits, old ideas, and old culture. Their leading figure, Jiang Qing, aka Mrs. Mao, was a particularly awful person. Mao's cult of personality reached unimaginable heights, and no person in history has been able to have such a grip over so many people. More than 1 billion copies of the iconic Little Red Book, the quotations of Mao Zedong, were printed, and he then purged some of the biggest names in the Chinese Communist Party. Students calling themselves Red Guards went around beating up anyone they thought was a revisionist, and held huge demonstrations which attracted millions of people from across the country. The situation got so bad that Mao eventually had to order the Red Guards to disband, and over 12 million people were sent down to the countryside. And they weren't too happy about their new way of life. But Mao told them to do it, so they did it. And by the way, most of the politicians that lead China today grew up in this absolute chaos. All in all, around 3 million people killed during the Cultural Revolution, and around 36 million were persecuted or publicly humiliated, and all of urban society was involved in one way or another. Whilst this attack on capitalism was going on, Mao seemed to think that the country that could help them out with this was the United States of America. Well, not really, but after a long period of hostility between China and the US, both sides wanted to see if their relations could improve, possibly as an anti-Soviet Union alliance. So Nixon sent his other half Kissinger to China, and things were going surprisingly well. Dialogue was good, trade restrictions were lifted, and the two powers would eventually restore full diplomatic relations in 1979, and having China on America's side massively changed the dynamics of the Cold War. But in 1976, Mao died, and at the end of his life he said that he accomplished two things. First, he had fought Chiang Kai-shek for decades and drove him to Taiwan, and the second is he initiated the Cultural Revolution, which is supported by few and opposed by many. But the work has not been finished, and its legacy must be carried down to the next generation. Well, the Gang of Four were really the only ones who wanted to carry on with the Cultural Revolution, and without Mao's backing, everyone was just fed up with them, and they were all put in prison. One of the people who was denounced during the Cultural Revolution was brought back into politics, and he would completely change the path of Chinese and global history. So Deng Xiaoping had a long history with the Chinese Communist Party. He was a Long March survivor, and he played a big role in the war against Japan and the Civil War. He remained one of the leading figures in Chinese politics until the Cultural Revolution, when he was branded as a capitalist roader, and he and his family were persecuted. He was brought back into politics a few years later, and he eventually weaved his way back to the top. From there, he basically said that the last decade was a dark period in Chinese history, and rehabilitated over 3 million victims of the Cultural Revolution. It was a good start, but there was still a lot of work to do, specifically the economy. In the countryside, collectivization wasn't doing a great job, and people realized that if the state takes away all your output, and you can't sell your surpluses for profit, what was the point of working harder? Rural markets appeared for the first time in decades, and agricultural output massively expanded in the next few years. But another important note is that the Chinese population had reached over 1 billion people by 1980, and it was believed that if the population continued to grow so rapidly, it would be impossible to govern and feed so many people. So the one-child policy was introduced in 1980, and today's China would probably face some of the long-term consequences of such a radical policy. Then you have the industry and infrastructure in China, which was still very backwards. This was in contrast to Asian tiger countries, who were growing ridiculously quickly. This included Taiwan, which was ruled by Chiang Kai-shek until he died in 1975, and there was a big question about whether China could have undergone something similar if it didn't adopt a socialist economy. Deng Xiaoping was different, and he believed that it doesn't matter whether you have a state-planned economy or a market-based economy, as long as it works. So Deng did a complete 180 from socialism and liberalized the Chinese economy. He created 4 special economic zones in the south, which welcomed foreign capital and technology. These cities focused entirely on exports, and they developed rapidly year on year. Soon the entire west coast of China was opened up to foreign investment, and this kick-started what is known as a Chinese economic miracle, as within the next few decades, hundreds of millions of people lifted themselves out of poverty, thanks to these free market reforms. But as happy as people were with the economy, there were still some major issues to be addressed. With China opening up to free market policies, you may also think they'd open up to democracy, like so many other countries have done. Well, on the 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement, over 150,000 people gathered in Tiananmen Square, calling for democracy and an end to corruption in the Communist Party. In the next few weeks, over 1 million people would assemble in the square, many going on hunger strikes, and demanded political change. Well, the timing was absolutely brilliant, because at the same time, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was coming to visit China after about a 30-year break in relations between the two countries. International media had an absolute field day with this, and the protests were a real loss of face for the regime. After Gorbachev left, Deng decided that a crackdown was in order, and on the 4th of June, the PLA came into Tiananmen Square and started shooting thousands of civilians. And Deng made it pretty clear that China would be as authoritarian as ever. Of course, the Chinese government will deny this ever happens, but they can't watch. YouTube's banned in China anyway. In the aftermath of the massacre, the brutality showed by their regime was condemned around the world, and the hardliners in the Communist Party have dominated ever since. Deng stepped out of politics, and another hardliner, Jiang Zemin, leads China during the 90s. Jiang Zemin was a bit of a joker, but don't let that smile fool you. Just like Deng, he made sure that everyone knows that political dissent will not be tolerated. During the 90s, we see strong and sustained economic growth in China, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, the PRC became the only major communist country in the world. And finally, in 1997, the last scar of China's colonial past was healed, as Hong Kong was handed back to them by the British. But there's been a few issues with the whole democracy thing, and that's a whole other story. As you get into the 2000s, you see the rise of China to the superpower that we know today. And that pretty much covers the entire 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more just like this. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to end this video with some wise words from the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping.
我在北京